Hello guys, welcome back. Today I'm going to be grading every single NHL team at this year's 2022 NHL trade deadline. Now over the past week we saw a bunch of big moves being made, some teams looking very good because of it and other teams not so much. But when it comes to all the moves made in the last few weeks with every single NHL team, how good do I think they performed? Was it great? Was it bad? What moves did they make? And which teams came out the best and worst? Watch till the end for every single grade on every single team, and make sure you hit that subscribe button if you are new. 50% of the people that are watching are not subscribed, so if you like hockey, this channel is the place to be. Now we're going to go through all four divisions and every single team, and we're going to start out by grading every team in the Atlantic division, and the first team to talk about here is the Boston Bruins and how they did at this year's NHL trade deadline. Obviously some of the bigger moves, the big one was Hampus, Lindholm. They acquired Josh Brown as well in a separate deal, but I feel when it comes to the Bruins, they had some pretty big missed opportunity. They had $6 million to work with on deadline day, and they were in the mix for Rickard, Rakell, and considering how much Pittsburgh had to pay for Rakell, I feel like Boston could have easily made that happen. If it was a second round pick, a goalie prospect, and something on top of that, I feel like the Bruins definitely could have made that happen and added Rickard, Rakell easily onto that middle six. Yes, they upgrade that defense, which I think was necessary, and the Bruins still look like a fantastic team, but I'm going to give them a C, mostly because of the missed potential that they had. Now going on to the next team in the Buffalo Sabres, this is another team that I think had some missed potential. You didn't end up finding a defenseman for Owen Power like the Sabres were rumored to get. There were some other players like Craig Anderson and Victor Olofsson and Cody Eakin that they didn't deal. A lot of missed opportunity as well for the Sabres, but more on the selling side of things. I give them a D+. They did fine with the Hagel deal, I guess, but besides that, they had a much better opportunity to sell and get some pretty big assets with what these players were able to command at the deadline this year. Now moving on to the Detroit Red Wings, I thought they had a pretty solid trade deadline overall. The big one obviously was the Nick Leddy deal where they got a second round pick, Jake Wallman, and Oscar Sundqvist back, which I think was a pretty solid deal for them, honestly, and definitely a very good trade for the Red Wings specifically. You also had, of course, the deal in Nemestikov getting a 4th rounder and Troy Stecher getting a 7th. Honestly, not too bad. You could have sold some more, potentially with Thomas Greiss there, maybe Mark Stahl, but at the same time, I think it was a fine deadline, and I think a C+ honestly fits what they were able to get back, and even getting a second round pick alone for Nick Leddy is pretty fantastic. But now moving on to one of the bigger buyers of the deadline in the Florida Panthers, a pretty interesting one, and especially over the past couple of weeks, probably the most active NHL team. They were interesting though, although I thought they could have used that Ekblad at LTAR space a little bit better. Still in the end, they got Claude Giroux, Ben Chiarot, they got some depth in Robert Hagel. Not too bad of a job for Florida. I'd give them an A+, but again, they're strengthening themselves for the playoffs, which is what Bill Zito should be doing. Now going on to the Montreal Canadiens. Speaking of great trade deadlines, the Habs had themselves an amazing last month. Just looking at the hauls of Tyler Toffoli, Ben Chiarot got an amazing haul, Artturi Lehkonen, Andrew Hammond was another deal we saw, Brett Kulak, a lot of great top 60 picks acquired by Montreal that will definitely be useful for them. We'll obviously see what happens with those guys, but I think personally with Montreal, they were able to maximize their assets, and even though they didn't go completely in the selling direction, they sold the guys they needed to, and I think that's just fine. I'd give them an A+ because Kent Hughes is a legend. Now going on to the Ottawa Senators, one of the more interesting teams of the deadline. I'm going to go right out and say it. I think the Sens get a C+ for this deadline. They started off horribly with the Travis Hamonic deal. There's no possible world in which Hamonic is worth a 3rd round pick. I thought initially the Sens would be taking on Hamonic's contract and getting a pick for that, but instead they just take him for a 3rd rounder, which I think is horrible. But they also made a couple of decent moves. I like the return on the Nick Paul trade. They also got Zach Senyshyn for his Josh Brown, which I think is a good positive trade for them. And they also had an interesting one too on top of that, where they got traded away Zach Sanford away to Winnipeg, which especially with how he played this season, I think was a good move to make. Overall, not a bad trade deadline whatsoever, and a fun one for the Sens. Then going on to the Tampa Bay Lightning, I've kind of gone back and forth on what I actually think with their deadline. I'm going to give them a straight B. Overall, I do think even though the overpays for Nick Paul and Brandon Hagel are there, they are moves that will definitely strengthen that bottom 6 and make Tampa way harder to play against. And when we talk about Tampa's situation, they're in the spot where they can afford to give away 1st round picks forever and ever, because at this point, this is the team to contend with, and Hagel and Nick Paul help a lot with that. But then going on to Toronto, I'm also going to give the Leafs a straight B. They obviously had the Travis Dermott trade, but later traded for Mark Giordano and Colin Blackwell, which, considering it only cost 2 seconds and a third, I think is pretty miraculous work by Kyle Dubas. It would be higher if they acquired a goaltender, but it felt like that was not going to happen, and we also saw the lack of a scoring leader, which I think was a little bit disappointing. At the same time, though, I felt like they really needed somebody on that defense. Mark Giordano brings great defensive play and brings great veteran leadership, and I think on this Leafs team, that is exactly what they need. But now we're going to move on to the Pacific Division and move on to the first team here in the Anaheim Ducks and their trade deadline grade. Personally, for me, when it comes to Anaheim, they did pretty well over the past couple of weeks, definitely being one of the bigger sellers. They traded Manson, Delorier, Lindholm, Rakell, but I think, honestly, the Ducks trade deadline is pretty well summed up in that Delorier trade, where they got a third-round pick for him, which I think is miraculous, but they got a great trade with Hampus, Lindholm, and a lot of return back. Same thing with Josh Manson, and a decent return for Rickard, Rakell. Overall, I think for the Ducks, they looked at themselves, knew they weren't there quite yet, and are still building for the future, which I think is the right decision for them. So, honestly, A for the Ducks. Now going on to the Flames, next up, they're a team that I thought also did pretty well, being one of the bigger buyers. They obviously went out and got Tyler Toffoli, also Calle Jarnkrok, and got some depth as well in Ryan Carpenter. Overall, a B+, nothing too fancy, but definitely some additions that will especially help them in the first round. Now going on to Edmonton and their grade for the deadline this year, I thought Edmonton did okay. Nothing amazing, but made a couple of moves that will definitely help them depth-wise. Brett Kulak was one that some people might say is an overpay, but I could see him playing all across the Oilers' defense and being a smart defensive defenseman, which I think for the Oilers is exactly what they were searching for and needing. You also got a depth player as well in Derek Brassard, who can provide a lot of value, especially when we go into that bottom six. I think for Edmonton, it was nothing fancy, but two moves that will help them in the first round, especially to hopefully have some playoff success. Overall, I'd give them a C+, not too bad of a deadline for them, even if it could be better. Now going on to the LA Kings, if we're wanting to talk about could be better, I think LA is a fantastic example. Although, yes, they can afford to not really do anything this year and still be competitive in the next 10 years, I think for LA, they missed some opportunity to be a lot more bulkier for the playoffs this time around. They made some smaller moves, obviously with some of their defensive injuries. They acquired Troy Stecher, they acquired players like Allard as well, but I felt like, again, for the LA Kings, when we're looking at bigger players there, I felt they could have made some moves potentially for Rickard, Rakell. Somebody else, especially on that forward group, I think would be necessary, but the Kings didn't do too much. They'll still be fine, but I would give them a C-. Going on to the next team here, the San Jose Sharks, they made a couple interesting moves. The most interesting, in my opinion, was the Kaapo Kähkönen deal, where they gave away one of their interesting defensive targets in Jacob Middleton and got Kähkönen and a pick back. Personally, for me, that is great work. I feel like Kraken has still a lot of potential in the NHL and could unlock that and hopefully solve some of those goaltending issues for the Sharks. We'll see what happens, but I think that's a solid one. And they also traded for Anthony Potato, some defensive depth, not much to say there. C+ for San Jose and a C- for LA. Next up, going to Seattle, they actually pleasantly surprised me at this deadline, making actually some very good moves and reversing some of the mistakes they made at the expansion draft. Obviously, they traded Giordano, Jarnkrok, Appleton, Johansson, and got some pretty good value back. Nothing absolutely amazing, but a lot of second-round picks, a lot of plethora of picks in these next couple of drafts. So honestly, it's really what Seattle should have done in the first place, but they do reverse some of their mistakes, having a solid trade deadline and getting a lot for their bigger players. Now going to Vancouver, by the way, Seattle gets an A. I think for Vancouver, they're an interesting one too. I thought the deals they made were pretty solid, but I think there was also some missed potential. There obviously will be some other trades happening in the offseason with Brock Besser and Connor Garland potentially being out there with cap issues facing Vancouver, but we did see the Tyler Motte trade. We saw basically them exchanging Travis Dermott for Travis Hamonic, which I think is an amazing one-for-one looking at it right now. And I think overall for the Canucks, it was a solid job by them, and I give them a straight B. Then going on to Vegas, I don't really blame them too much for not really doing anything. They didn't have the cap space to really do anything at all, but I will give them a D- and D+. They had the Dadanov trade, but that's pretty much it. Nothing to really talk about there. Now going on to the Metro, and honestly, I feel like this was a pretty mixed bag division. Some teams did great, some teams did pretty meh. Now, the Carolina Hurricanes, I thought did a solid job. They didn't do anything until the Max Domi deal, but they only had to give up a third-round pick, who in my opinion is not that great of a prospect, to get Max Domi, and I thought he was a guy that could fit pretty well in that middle six and bring some good speed and some tenacity. I think that was a great deal, and I think that puts them over the edge. Now, speaking of that Max Domi deal, we now go on to Columbus, and I don't really know what Jarmo was doing at this deadline, but personally for me, I think it was a pretty garbage deadline for Columbus. They had a ton of options to trade. They obviously did get Max Domi away from themselves, but they got Aiden Reshik, who in my opinion will at most be maybe a sixth defenseman in the NHL. For a guy who was a middle six player, even if they probably weren't going to re-sign him, I still felt like there could have been something more out there. Also, you have the potential deals of Jonas Korpisalo. There was Jack Razlovic out there too. There were some options the Blue Jackets could have done that could have been better for them, but they made one trade and it was pretty rough for them. So I'll give them the 1F of the video. I might be a little bit harsh, but still. Now we're going to move on to the New Jersey Devils, another team that really didn't do that much. I'm going to give them a D+. They obviously acquired Andrew Hammond, but there was no deal with Zacha, no deal with Subban, and no new goaltender coming onto the team. Once again, another team that had kind of some missed potential and really didn't maximize what they could have done at this year's deadline. Then going on to the Islanders, I'm just going to go out and give them a straight D because nothing happened with them. They didn't trade any other guys. Varlamov, Clutterbuck, Andy Green, nothing. So it's obvious that they're still looking to really compete next year. We'll see if they can actually re-sign Noah Dobson, but the Islanders keep their party going, I guess, and I think that's just fine. It's okay. It's whatever. Now going on to the New York Rangers, this was a team that loaded up right at the very end of this deadline. Before that, they got Frank Vatrano, but as also we saw the Anthony Potato deal, but right at the very end, they traded for both Tyler Mott and Andrew Copp, and although there was a chance for that Andrew Copp trade to be a little bit of an overpayment, I think it was an overpayment for the Rangers that they definitely can afford to make, and also only giving away a 4th-round pick for Tyler Mott is absolutely amazing value. The Rangers definitely adding on to that forward group quite well, and also only having to trade away a 3rd for Justin Braun, who will definitely help that bottom pair. Overall, great deadline for the Rangers and exactly what they needed. Next up for the Flyers, we all know what happened with them. They had a bunch of guys they were going to trade but couldn't get maximum value for because of their situations. Overall though, even though they lost the Giroux trade and weren't getting the greatest value back for Braun, it was, I guess, the best they could have done. I just feel bad for Flyers fans, honestly. Just a rough deadline for them overall. After that, we have the Pittsburgh Penguins, who really the big trade they made was the Rickard Rakell deal. They also got a depth defenseman in Nathan Beaulieu, who I hope doesn't play because he's not that good. But with Rickard Rakell, they didn't really trade that much to be able to acquire him, especially for the Penguins. Only a 2nd rounder, a depth player, and a depth goaltender in the system. I think overall that's a pretty good hockey deal for the Penguins to make, and adding onto that second line, potentially being with Evgeny Malkin, I think would be a great playmaker and scoring winger fit. Now going on to the last team in the Metro, though, is the Washington Capitals. They only made 2 moves, but even though they are smaller, I think it'll definitely help their depth. They made a Marcus Johansson deal, which I think is going to help being back on that team, and you also got Johan Larsson, who I think was one of the more underrated defensive players of this deadline. He can be a 4th-line center, he can play wing, he can do whatever you want him to do. Pretty versatile, and I think he'll definitely help the Caps, especially when they make the playoffs. But now going into the last division in the Central, the first team we have here is the Arizona Coyotes, and they didn't make as many moves as we thought, but overall it was solid for them. They obviously took on Brian Little's contract and got Nathan Smith back from the Jets. They also got the Jack McBain trade, which I think isn't the greatest for them. The 2nd-round pick for him I think is pretty bad, but still, I do think McBain can be an NHL player for the Coyotes. And they also have the Larson deal, which they got a 3rd-round pick back, which I think was pretty fair value for what Johan Larsson got. Overall, I'd give him a C+, though definitely not as great as it could have been, especially if they traded a guy like Phil Kessel and gotten value back for him. Now going on to the Chicago Blackhawks, this was a pretty active team. You had Marc-Andre Fleury being dealt. You had other guys like Brandon Hagel and Ryan Carpenter too. I think overall the value that Chicago got back was perfectly fine, especially in the Brandon Hagel deal. Getting 2 first-round picks is excellent value. I would give them a B+. Overall, a solid job by Kyle Davidson. Next up, going to the Colorado Avalanche. This is going to be the only team other than Montreal, in my opinion, to get an A+. Artturi, Lehkonen, Josh Manson, Nico Sturm, Andrew Cogliano. Honestly, for all these guys, they didn't really have to pay too much either, and I think they all fit pretty well into Colorado's system. Overall, a great trade deadline, and it'll especially help them come playoff time to have guys like Lehkonen and Cogliano in the lineups. But now going on to my favorite team, the Dallas Stars. Overall, nothing to really report here. They got Scott Wedgwood, who is fine. They got Nemestikov, who is fine. Just a flat C. There could have been much more that Dallas did. Going on to Minnesota, though, they made some pretty big moves. Obviously, Fleury was the main one, and with their goaltending fiasco, circus, whatever you want to call it this year, I think Fleury could provide some stability there, hopefully. They also also ended up trading for Tyson Jost earlier in the week. They got, of course, they ended up trading McBain to the Coyotes for a second-round pick, which I think was pretty worth it for them. They acquired Delorier, they acquired Jacob Middleton. Overall, a lot of trades that will help them going into the playoffs. Having Fleury, having Middleton is huge, and Jost can also be a guy that surpasses expectations for them. I'd give them a B. Overall, solid trade deadline for many. Now going on to Nashville. This is going to be another team that I'm not really super high on. I'm not going to give them an F, but I am going to give them a D-. Another team that, in my opinion, had so much wasted potential. And the trades they did make, in my opinion, weren't that great. The LR trade, I think, was a waste of a decent prospect defensively. And they also traded a second for Jeremy Lauzon, which I think is horrible for them. Lauzon still might be something, but for a second-round pick, I think that is heavily overvaluing him personally. I think for Nashville, they had $50 million in cap space this year. They had so much opportunity to go after some big guys and truly compete. And in my opinion, you're probably going to see another wasted season of Roman Josi and UC Saros, which is unfortunate because I think this Preds team could do some damage if they had just a couple more additions, especially on that forward group. Now going on to the next team, the St. Louis Blues, I'm going to give them a D as well. The only big trade they made was the Nick Leddy deal, and trading a second and also Jake Wallman and Oscar Sundqvist. I mean, Sundqvist wasn't really going to play for them either, but Wallman could be a guy for them long term, and a second round pick. I think personally it's heavily overvaluing Leddy. I like that they went after one defenseman, but I definitely didn't really feel like the Leddy fit would be perfect for them. I feel like he might be okay come playoff time, but I really hope the Blues are just looking at him as a one-year thing. But then going on to the last team in the list in the Winnipeg Jets. Overall, I thought they had a solid trade deadline. Nothing spectacular, but some pretty decent moves. They reacquired Mason Appleton. They end up trading away Nathan Beaulieu, which is a godsend for that defense. They, of course, trade away the Brian Little contract and traded Andrew Copp too, also reacquiring Sanford. Overall, I feel like, or not reacquiring, acquiring Zach Sanford. Overall, especially with that Andrew Copp return, I felt Winnipeg did what they needed to do. There was still some missed potential. They could have traded Dylan. They could have traded Paul Stastny, and I still think Winnipeg should go in the rebuilding direction. But at the same time, they could keep themselves competitive with this deadline too going into next year and hopefully retool themselves if they want. But a solid deadline for the Jets. I'll give them a B- and be nice to them for now. But that'll be it for today, guys. Thank you so much for tuning in. Let me know in the comments down below what you guys agree and disagree with my grades. What would you grade your favorite NHL team at this year's deadline? And what trades do you guys think your team should have made? Let me know in the comments down below. Make sure you hit that like button, subscribe, hit that notification bell. Make sure you share this video with your friends. Get it out there. Click on this card for all my hockey rankings content right on playlist. My name is Nathan. Have a great day, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.